I came here for a variety of reasons. Number one, to be with Peter and Melanie Monk, whom I have gotten to know over the years, and I must say that what an impressive family, what you've done for this city, certainly for this great country of yours. Peter could not be here tonight, but I must tell you, I saw him in action a few months ago. There is no more dynamic speaker, I think, certainly not in the United States and not even in Canada. When Peter gets riled up and gets on what Canada is all about in terms of its freedom, its love of freedom, its resources, its people, the dynamism of the country, then you get inspired just listening to him. And I wanted to be here because of the Right Honorable Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. I recall meeting Brian, I should say Prime Minister Mulroney, back in 1984 when he was first elected. And he became part of a triumvirate. It was Brian Mulroney, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan. And the three of them really strode across the world and the globe promoting conservative values. And to see what you were able to accomplish. And I was looking through some old notes of Winston Churchill in the wilderness years. And he talked about ideas and leadership. And he said something to the effect, with broad vision and with high principles, with a good heart, and with a dedication to finding the compass and the charts, they could find their way on this voyage. And I thought that applied to you. Because you're a man of broad vision and high principles and a good heart and someone who reached out and tried to build a consensus in this country to move Canada forward. And so I think that we in the United States remain indebted to you, Brian. I think everybody in the United States knows who you are. They revere and relish the years that you spent together with Ronald Reagan, and I must say I count it among my blessings to know you. And especially tonight, I could have listened to you all evening. Go on. And you mentioned my poetry. Let me tell you that I am an accidental politician. When I was in college, I wanted to play professional basketball. And that's what I was dreaming to become, a professional basketball player. And you can see there's some limitations to my ambitions. Nonetheless, that was the goal until I met a professor of mine. I understand we have some academics and professors here tonight. And my professor said that everyone in the class will write a sonnet. And I went to him and said, Professor Gleason, in essence, real men don't write poetry. I'm the captain of the basketball team, and we're traveling for the next several months, and I can't possibly write this sonnet. He said, you will write a sonnet or you will flunk this course. So I went about the next couple of weeks. I had never read a poem, had never written one. And so I found myself in the library one evening, and I was looking through some magazines, and I saw a study that had been done that measured the relationship between the season and the mating instinct among people, among animals. And I said, well, maybe it applies to people too. So I wrote my first sonnet, which I will recite to you tonight. Winter freezes summer blood to ice, and it chills the passions that await the spring. The lover suffers season's sacrifice at altars bleak with crystal covering. Now what heart can hold a love in wintertime when even nature slacks her passion pace, when minor creatures flee the upper clime for warmer realms of borrowed or burrowed space? But spring has courage to oppose the cold, and it passes on to those in love the same. The sound of love take hold of human ears that closed at winter's name. Ah, but is it fair to unimpassioned reason to say that love depends upon a season? Now, I got a C for that poem. But what it did is it forced me to look at myself differently. I saw myself as a big man on a little campus. And this professor shows you how one person can change your life. And so it forced me to look at myself differently, that, yeah, I could read this, I could even write some of it, and I could have a broader vision in terms of studying literature and the great arts. So that was how I sort of evolved into a Latin major, then on to law school, etc. But it has always stayed with me in terms of the impact that a teacher can have upon one's life and course of life. Now, I mentioned Ronald Reagan before, and we saw President Obama last evening give his speech to the State of the Union. And he said, basically, the state of the United States is strong. It's fragile, but it's strong. And I was thinking about it last evening that I also had a chance when I was in office to meet Boris Yeltsin when he was president of Russia. And Bob Dole had asked me to come to his office. I had just written a novel called One-Eyed Kings, and I presented it to Boris Yeltsin. And I told him in advance, I said, look, I hate to tell you this, but in this novel, you are assassinated. And I told him how it was going to be done, and I have a great picture in my office. He goes, "Nyet." And he said science fiction. Well, it turned out 3 weeks after that event took place, there was a coup attempt, and they were trying to do exactly what I had reckoned in the book. So I think of Yeltsin because Yeltsin was also at a press conference. This is well known, documented. At a press conference, he was asked by a journalist. He said, if you had to sum up the state of the Russian economy in one word, what would that word be? He said, good. And then the reporter, being the reporter, said, I had a follow-up question. He said, but if you had to sum it up with 2 words, what would it be? Not good. And isn't that about where we are in the United States? Because some of the signs that we see taking place, the economy seems to be coming out of it. It seems to be getting better, and some real positive traits that we can see. But also I mentioned the fragility of it, because we still have a lot of paralysis in Washington. You saw the president last night try to reach out and say, let's see if we can't find common ground. And it's interesting about the word common ground. If you notice, the word compromise has not been used in the last couple of years. It's been poll tested. If you use the word compromise, it signifies weakness or lack of principle. And remember Speaker Boehner, when he was first interviewed on 60 Minutes, and he gave a great interview. He said, I will never compromise my principles. I am willing to search for common ground. So common ground is something that everybody can now rally around, and it's something that we have to do in our country. Because if we continue to do what we have done, then we will continue to see paralysis. I thought of Ronald Reagan last night as well, because he said that government is, after all, like a baby's alimentary canal. It has a healthy appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other. And that really kind of sums it up, that we've had these great appetites at one end of our canal as such, and not too much responsibility on the other. And what we have got to come back to is a sense of discipline, a sense of proportion. And that's what I think the president was trying to say last evening, and say, let's find common ground how we can deal with these issues. On the other hand, he spent most of his time talking about the economy. He spent most of the time talking about what government was going to do, rather than what kind of reductions we were going to see in the level of our appetite. And that's where the crunch is going to come in the next year. Whether or not there'll be an effort made to move toward something like Simpson-Bowles, which is something that he actually created this commission. And then they came back. They had, I think, 9 votes, and they needed 14 to get a vote in the Congress, but he got only 9. And basically, everybody walked away from Simpson-Bowles. But I think we have to come back to it. We have to come back to a sense of discipline. And we have to come back to a sense of who we are. I think the major question for the United States is going to be, who are we? What is our role in the world today? And what kind of a world are we looking at? So we have to go through this kind of existential exercise in deciding what our role is going to be in a world that is marked by what? By turbulence. Alan Greenspan wrote his memoir. It's called The Age of Turbulence. Bob Rubin wrote his memoir, and he said, The Age of Uncertainty, an uncertain world. You've got Nicholas Nassim Taleb, whose book was Black Swan. And so we're living in an age of black swans, or the age of the unthinkable, or future shock. But it all is symbolized by uncertainty and turbulence. So the question then becomes, what is our strategy? And here the Chinese philosopher becomes kind of important. Sun Tzu said, if you have strategy without tactics, it's the slow road to victory. If you have tactics but no strategy, that's the noise before defeat. And so we have to have a strategy about where we want to go and what this world is going to look like and what kind of a role we can play. And so that's the analysis that we're going through now. I was influenced back in the 1960s by John F. Kennedy. And I'll never forget his inaugural when he said, let every nation know, whether they bear us well or ill, that we will endure any hardship, will pay any price, will bear any burden, will oppose any foe, will befriend and support any friend in order to ensure the success and survival of liberty. Boy, I was really inspired. And could a president say that today? That's not what President Obama said last night. He said that we have to really draw back, that we have been overcommitted, that we basically have spent roughly $1 trillion in Iraq, close to $1 trillion by the time we're out of Afghanistan, to the extent that we're out of Afghanistan, and lots of blood and treasure has been spent. And the American people are pretty fatigued with our commitment. So the question is, well, what do we do? Can we afford to draw back? Can we afford to come home, America? You may recall this back in 1972 with George McGovern was running. He said, come home, America. We have some in the Republican Party who say the same thing. Let's come back. Let's disentangle ourselves from foreign affairs. So you've got people at both ends of the political spectrum who want to come home. The problem is we can't walk away from the world because the world isn't going to walk away from us. And so we can't simply return to a continental cocoon and tuck ourselves in and think that the world can be watched on CNN or MSNBC or any of Bloomberg and think that we are going to be untouched by it. I see that you've had Bob Woodward here. One of my favorites is Tom Friedman. Friedman wrote his book about the earth, the world being flat. And he told a great story about it. He said, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He sailed off to find India, and he ended up in America. He thought the world was flat, and he found out it was round. Friedman, in 2004, said he flew off to India, knowing the world is round, he found it was flat. That science had flattened the world. That science had flattened the world in such a way that information and knowledge was now being democratized. Everybody had access now to the same information. And so you say, that's good. That's a good thing. But, science and information is pretty neutral. Science it's all head, has no heart. So the same information and science available or created by Bill Gates is available to the bin Ladens. And so we have to think this is the world in which we live now, that knowledge and information has been democratized. So how do we cope with that in a world that's increasingly turbulent? And that's where we all find ourselves, not just the United States. The question is, what about our friends? And I say Canada. We share more than simply a border. We share ideals. We share interests. We believe in freedom. We believe in the individual rising to his or her highest level, etc. But you've been with us. In virtually every campaign you have been with us, and you're with us now in Afghanistan. And so what we do will have an impact in Canada as well. So now we have to decide, what are we looking at in the world? Well, we look at the Arab Spring. Prime Minister Mulroney mentioned the world being changing. Arab Spring. We have less influence in Egypt today than we had before. The events have not completely unfolded in Egypt. We don't know how it's going to go. We have been relegated to the sidelines. We have tried to be helpful in creating institutions for the rule of law and promoting equality for all, but we don't know. We don't know how it's going to unfold. What happens in Egypt also affects what happens in the region. We have Libya. We still don't know how it will unfold. We have Syria that continues with the civil war. And then we have a country called Iran. And that is going to be a central issue for this country to deal with. Now, I was in Munich last week when Vice President Biden gave his speech to the security conference in Munich. And he basically reached out and said, we're willing to talk face-to-face with the Iranians. And that proposal was basically shot down. And so the question then becomes, what is going to happen in that region? And that will have an impact on all of us. And there are no good options in dealing with Iran. There are three. Number one, we can continue to intensify sanctions. And we need to have the support of the Russians and the Chinese in this. In fact, I have maintained that there is a Chinese card to be played by the Chinese. And that is because they have a major interest in the security of that resource coming out of Iran going to China. So we need them to play a bigger role. We can think about the military option. That has all sorts of untoward consequences if we were to take military action, but I want to talk about that in a second. Or we can just live with a bomb, and that's the third option. None of them are particularly attractive. In terms of the military option, why I mentioned that I think China really is in has the ability to alter the course of events. I think 2013 is going to be crucial. I think if you look at what's taking place in terms of the Israelis, who now look around the neighborhood, they don't have Mubarak in Egypt. They don't have Syria in terms of, even as bad as it was, they still knew who they were dealing with the Assad regime. They look at Lebanon, where there are tens of thousands of weapons now pointed at them. And they look at Iran. Their threshold for taking action is lower than ours. And that's because they sit closer to the potential of what that means for them. And so the United States has taken a different tack. We've had a higher threshold. And so there's been some friction in terms of disagreement in terms of whether it becomes necessary to take action. What I have maintained in dealing with the Chinese leaders in recent years, to be sure, is that the military option, which is way down here at the end of this table, keeps moving closer to the center of the table. Every time negotiations continue to fail, every time there is a new intelligence report about progress being made in terms of the enrichment, then the military option comes closer to the center of the table. And if that takes place, then everybody has a big interest at stake. So China has a bigger role to play than they're playing, as do the Russians. Russia has a bigger role to play in Syria than it's currently playing. That's their client state. They have stayed above the fray and away from the fray. In fact, they've even contributed to it by trying to send weapons into Syria at a time when the civil war is unfolding. So Russia is in a position also to be a peacemaker. They could come in and offer a solution to stabilizing Syria. They have refused to do so to date. But I think it's in their interest, their long-term interests in that region, to say that they're playing a role which is almost inevitable Assad's going to go, and they should want to have a role in seeing how it unfolds from that point forward. So that remains an area of great instability, and is going to be so for the rest, certainly this year and beyond. Now move into Asia. You heard the president in this past year talk about a pivot. I don't like the word pivot because it sounds like we're suddenly shifting out of one region and going to the other. We've been a Pacific power. We have been there. The reason that China's been able to grow is because we've been the great stabilizing force in the Asia-Pacific region. There was a time when the Chinese started to write these papers, time for the United States to go home, let Asians take care of Asia. And I went to talk to their military academy. And I said, this is the last thing you should want, is for us to leave. Why? Because we have been here stabilizing this region, and Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations have all taken place except the 4th one, and that's the military modernization. That's taking place now. They're now spending, admittedly, $100 billion on their military, what they'll admit to. $100 billion goes a lot further in China than it does in Canada or the United States, I can tell you. But that's what they've at least admitted. And they're building a military, and frankly, it's inevitable. 1.3 billion people with resources not only in the region but all over the world now. So their military might is going to be enhanced. What we have to do is make sure the military might is not used for aggressive purposes to dominate the region. And that's why President Obama has said we're going to shift our focus to the Asia-Pacific region, or pivot toward it. And what that means is this. We're going to put roughly 2,500 Marines into Darwin, Australia. Now, does 2,500 Marines shift the balance of power? If you ask the Marines, they will tell you yes, right? But no, it's an indication that we're going to strengthen our relationship in the region. It may grow to 5,000 or more, but that's what we're doing with Australia. We're going to start moving some ships through Singapore, what they call LCS, littoral combat ships, on a rotational basis. They're not going to be bases, it's going to be moving in there. We're doing more with the Philippines, rebuilding that relationship. We're building a closer relationship with, ironically, Vietnam. We're also strengthening the relationship with Japan. I just got back from Japan. They are increasing their defense budget for the first time in some years. That's of concern to some people in terms of what's taking place in Japan. And we're also building our relationship with India. Quietly but methodically building that relationship up. And what's the purpose of all of this? It can't be to contain China, because China can't be contained. But it can be a signal to say that we are a Pacific power, we're remaining one, and we're going to strengthen relationship with all of these democratic countries in order to make sure that no one power dominates the region. That's our message, the one that we convey to the Chinese. But there are tensions growing. Tensions in Japan, tensions in China, over some islands. And that's a flashpoint. We have to be very careful what takes place there. As there's a rising sense of nationalism in Japan, there's also one in China. And so we have to be concerned that these two forces don't find themselves fighting over islands that we have an interest in, because we have a treaty relationship with Japan. And so our goal is to try to at least dampen down the friction, try to soothe over some of the issues and seek a diplomatic resolution to it. And finally, just before I open it up to your questions, say a word about North Korea. There's very little we can do to North Korea. It is a hermetically sealed country. You have an authoritarian dictatorship that has suppressed its people. They are living in desperate poverty, many of them, if not most of them, in order to allow the ruling elite to continue to build missiles and test nuclear weapons underground. We have very little control over what we can do in response to that, nor do the South Koreans, nor do the Japanese or anyone else other than China. China, that's their client state again. So China has an interest in finding a way to try to persuade the North Koreans to open up. And this is a choice that they can make. China can help persuade them to take a different tack than one of simply building more weapons and then possibly becoming a proliferator. Let me conclude here because I, as a former senator, have the capacity to talk on at length. As you know, I was in the House of Representatives where they have a 5-minute rule. In the Senate, it's unlimited debate, and they can only take you off your feet if you have to hit the restroom or some other parliamentary device. Strom Thurmond held the record. I think it was 23 hours at one point. So I won't tarry on too much. Just conclude with an observation in terms of what, again, I come back to the role of the United States. I don't think we have any choice. The U.S. has to remain engaged in the world affairs. We are seeing a reduction in our military. We're seeing possibly the implementation of sequestration. That's coming very close, and if we don't do anything to delay it or overturn it, that means like some $40 billion will be coming out of the defense budget in the next 7 months. And so that would have a devastating impact upon our military readiness and capability. And that's what I meant about strategy and tactics, that we have to have a strategy first and then tactics that follow it. We should have a strategy that then is followed by a budget. Identify what are the threats out there. What are they? We have something called QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, and we try to review the nature of the threats that are out on the horizon. And then we try to come up with, here are our recommendations how to confront those threats, and then appropriate the dollars for it. Now it's being budget driven. So the budget is driving the strategy. It's just the reverse of what needs to take place. And I think it would be a travesty if we allowed it to go into effect, but some are now talking about it saying it'll only be for a month, and then everybody will get their senses. I think that's really very dangerous for all of us. So the U.S. has a major role to play. We're talking about defense in an age of austerity, of cutbacks, but we have to take care. We can make reductions provided they're done consistent to a strategy. And if we simply do it because it's across the board, and that's the easy way to solve budgetary problems, we make a terrible mistake for ourselves. And a final comment perhaps on the U.S. I was thinking what John Gardner said many years ago, he was former secretary when it was HEW. He said that the trouble is that our institutions in Washington have become caught in a savage crossfire between unloving critics and uncritical lovers. And it was a wonderful disposition of where we are today even. That was said many, many years ago. We have people, the unloving critics, the people are so critical about everything that they see. It's always negative, 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 and they'll do everything they can to bring it down. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the uncritical lovers, people who only see the status quo and like the way things are and don't want to see any change. And what the message was that we have to become loving critics. We have to be willing to look at ourselves, our institutions, and our challenges, and be willing to modify them. It's sort of like if you look at a pond, a still pond, you have death and decay, and you look at a river, it's life flowing through it. It's open at both ends. And so what we have to do is to be open at both ends, to get rid of things that don't work, to be willing to embrace things that will work, or hopefully will work. And so that, I think, is the message for those in Congress, to say be willing to seek common ground, be willing to be open to new ideas. They can be conservative ideas, which I think still has the greatest merit of all, that we want to have a conservative government, that we want to be compassionate, as Prime Minister Mulroney was certainly during his tenure in office, to be conservative, but also to be willing to deal with the most disadvantaged. That is something that all of us can rally around. I'm going to stop here and invite your questions if you have any. I see the hour is getting late.
Well, you talked about a teacher that inspired you, and I think you were a great teacher tonight, covering a variety of issues. And just as we position the microphones, let me ask you a question that I think is on a lot of Canadians' minds, and that's about sequestration. It is, 2 weeks out now. There is no deal. There is a real worry here of damage to the fragile economic recovery that you described tonight. You spent 25 years in Congress. Is there going to be a deal by March 1st, or are we into, the fiscal cliff part 2? And what does that say about American competency? What does that say about the ability of your political institutions to address the challenges that your nation faces?
Do I detect a rhetorical question? The way that I'm more pessimistic, frankly, about the outcome of this. There may be some temporary postponing, but we can't keep kicking the can down. And that's what we seem to be doing now. Now you have a number of people coming out and say, well, the debt's really not that bad. It's only $16 trillion. We're only running deficits of 1.2 or 3 trillion a year. So why worry about this? And so that element is creeping into the dialogue as well. Things are getting better. It'll all work out. But the problem is we've got entitlement programs which are unsustainable. And I think we're going to have to come back. I think the Republicans are right to say, wait a minute. You just increased taxes. Now you want to increase more taxes. When do we get to the spending cuts? And there's very little incentive on the part of the Democratic majority in the Senate at this point to really address those. I think we have to look at affluence testing. I think we have to look at retirement ages. I think we have to look at people who can afford to forego some of the benefits that we've enjoyed. But we've got to start dealing with the spending side of things as well as the taxes, which we've already increased. So do I think it's likely in 2 weeks? I'm more pessimistic about it. I think what's going to happen is the defense budget is going to be one that they're going to focus on the most seriously, because if we have those cuts that go into effect, what does it do? It means immediately we start reducing the size of our force. We stop training. We stop the programs that are in progress. We start to have the possibility of what we call a hollow force. So all of these things will have a major impact. And guess what? Other people are watching what we do. When we start talking about pivoting to the Asia-Pacific region, people over there saying, great, you talk a great game, show me the money. Where is your budget? And so I think we are sending signals of inconstancy, of stagnation, paralysis, that the system is not working. And because the middle has been hollowed out, and this is what's been taking place politically, that people at one time who could reach across the aisle and make a deal no longer are there to make a deal. Their arms have been lopped off. So you have people like Richard Lugar, who lost the last election. You have others who have been either retired or eliminated. So you have Democrats coming in tend to be more liberal. Republicans coming in tend to be more conservative. Where's the middle? That's where most people live. And yet we don't seem to be able to get a consensus on that. So I think we may have some short-term pain, and then I think people will come to the realization we can't afford to do this, because it hits most Americans, those who can least afford it, hard. It hits the military very hard, and as you saw last night during the address, the biggest round of applause, of course, went to those who are defending us all across the globe.
Great. Let's go to some questions on the floor. I'll just look for hands. I see one from Jim Doak. Oh, Jim, let's just get a microphone to you. You're a seasoned BNN commentator. You should know, sir, to be microphone first.
Mr. Secretary, a lot of us see a conflict looming in Africa between China and the West, especially if you have a mining company. Your country has been conspicuous by its absence there so far. How do you think the U.S. should be engaged in Africa?
Well, some years ago, the United States was engaged on a tentative basis, at least, by creating something called the African Crisis Response Initiative, acronym ACRI. We were very reluctant to become too actively involved in Africa because of the sense of colonialization still ran very deep, and the United States wanted to back away from that. So we created this command, which is based in Europe, in Stuttgart. Actually, the AFRICOM is in Stuttgart. So we don't have boots on the ground in Africa. What we have tried to do is to help train and even equip the African nations to take care of their own problems on the continent. Hasn't always worked out that way, but that has been the goal. It continues to be the goal. So the United States has been very tentative on this issue. Now, as terror groups start to shift their focus, forget China for the moment, but now we're seeing in Mali and elsewhere that terrorism is like it's like mercury, what I call mercury on a mirror. You can try to grasp it here, and it just slips away somewhere else. And that's what's going on. You're going to see wherever you can clamp down on acts of terrorism, it's going to shift its focus. I think much of the focus is going to be in Africa. And China, of course, they're really just taking the resources, right? And I think you're going to see, I think you'll see in the not-too-distant future a much more expeditionary China. Now, Hu Jintao, when he gave his final address, he said, we are going to be a maritime power. He didn't say a regional maritime power. He said a maritime power. What does that mean? They now are acquiring assets all over the world. And it would seem inevitable to me that they're going to build a military capability that will start to protect those assets all the way across the globe. So we have to be concerned about that, and again, make sure that we're sending the right kind of signals, that we're working with our European friends, that we're working with our Asian friends to make sure that that growing military power is used for positive purposes and not for dominating the African continent or any other part of the world. It's a real challenge for us as we're going through this period of cutting back, reducing, and trying to make sure that we don't commit our forces to a region and find that we don't have either the resources or the will to stay there.
Just while we look for another question, what's your take on drone warfare? Do you think it's ethical for the United States to be flying over sovereign states, conducting military operations against targets that also involve significant civilian casualties?
It all depends. It all depends on what country you're flying over. Basically, you're not flying drones over countries in which you don't have either express or implied permission to do so. A country may say something publicly. It's quite different than what they say privately. So whether or not you are flying, I mean, you can't just invade someone's territory and fire missiles and kill people inside their territory without having some understanding of what the rules of engagement are. So start with that proposition. I have several questions about the use of drones. Number one, I want to know the process under which people are selected for being targeted. Who gets to decide? What's the information? What is the intelligence that is being gathered? What's the integrity of that process of gathering information that I should pick you or you or you to be on my list? And who gets to ultimately decide? Well, you say the president is the ultimate decider on this. Well, okay, we trust the president to be doing the nation's work and picking the right people, getting information, but for me, that's not quite good enough. I want to go back to Ronald Reagan again, trust but verify. We trust the President of the United States, but we need to have some check. We have to have some independent eyes on who's being selected, how is that information being gathered, how reliable is that information, and then assuming it's reliable, what is the reliability of the integrity of the network and the data network that you transfer from your drones and from the guys who are controlling those drones who are in Nevada. If we learned about hacking, you can hack into those systems as well. So even if you have reliable information that has been vetted all the way to the President of the United States, you have to ask other questions as well. But I go a little bit further and say if the President makes decisions based upon the use of drones on an emergency basis where something is about to happen and we have an opportunity to prevent an act of terror or anyone being harmed or us being harmed, then the President has the authority to do that. But you still want to have some check on that, and that can be either after the event, there has to be some small court, or maybe even a select committee from the two intelligence committees in the House and the Senate that reviews the process and the people and the means by which they have been selected. That's one major issue. And secondly, when you start weighing drones against aircraft, drones are much more specific. They're much less likely to kill innocent people. That's what they call collateral damage. That means killing innocent people. And so something that can be targeted specifically on a car as opposed to a bombing raid that takes out a whole area. You say, well, on the moral scale, that's probably preferable. But it raises the issue in terms of the future of warfare. And it raises the issue for me, you have to make sure that we don't think this is a video game, that it's a bloodless war that's being fought. Because every time we fire a missile, whether from an aircraft or a drone from a ship, you're killing somebody. And you're killing somebody who may not be your target. And if you do that, you're going to be creating enemies for which you will then have to be responsible for. So there are a lot of issues involved, and I would say drones shouldn't be off the table. They may be the future of warfare as is being conducted. But we have to make sure there is a check and a balance, and that's not simply the executive branch and the President of the United States making the decision.
Great. Let's go to David Cassidy. Dave.
Thanks, Richard. Secretary Cohen, you gave an analysis of Iran. The question is, would you care to say what you think is actually going to happen over the next 24 months? And a related question is, what do you think of Senator Hagel?
I support Senator Hagel. Senator Hagel is a friend. I think he's pretty independent-minded. I think, number one, you start with this proposition. The President of the United States just got elected. Basically, I think any president is entitled to pick the people for his cabinet unless you can find a morally compelling reason that the person he selected is so deficient in character or so off the mainstream in terms of philosophy that you couldn't possibly support him. Absent that, that's what elections are about. The president, prime minister, they get to pick the people they want advising them. And secondly, you remember this. Whatever Senator Hagel's views were or are, they are not the president. He's the one who has to decide. He's the commander-in-chief. And whether Senator Hagel thinks that action should be taken or not, that really is up to the president ultimately. I can tell you when I was in cabinet meetings, Secretary Albright and I didn't always agree, but we always had access to President Clinton and say, here are our views. Here's what I think, this is what Secretary thinks, and the president decides. And so don't think that Senator Hagel or Senator Kerry, for that matter, as state, that they have established, or they established a policy. The President of the United States established the policy. So I think that as far as Senator Hagel is concerned, I didn't see the conference. I was over in Munich during the confirmation hearing. I wasn't impressed with either the questions or even the answers. Frankly, I thought it was too hesitant. And I think I think he should be brought to the floor. I think he should go forward. I think there will be Republicans. Ironically, he was picked to help build Republican support for the president. The Republicans are the ones who are likely to vote against him because of some of his past statements. But I think from a personal point of view, I think that he has demonstrated his patriotism in this country. He has shed blood. He has taken blood on behalf of the country. And I think that he is worthy of being in that position. It's very controversial. I don't know whether it'll go forward, but I hope that it would. Secondly, with respect to what I think will take place, I think the longer this goes on, the threshold continues to drop in terms of military action. And I think the Israelis at some point are going to say, our intelligence convinces us that the window has closed. Now, tomorrow, for example, I will attend a dinner with the former Prime Minister and Defense Minister, Ehud Barak. I think that he has tried to come out and find a way to bring about some solution, not only on the Palestinian issue, but also to elevate the discussion about what Iran is doing. And I think he's a voice of moderation, but I think that he is a serious-minded individual who will try to persuade the president that the time is running short, and that military action, if taken by the Israelis, it's not that far off. He'll say it's not this year, but I think the longer this goes on, I think that becomes a more likely outcome.
I'm going to go to Alan Gottlieb next.
Thank you. Mr. Senator, further to the earlier question about drones, do you, further to your earlier remarks about drones, do you fear that if drones become an acceptable part of the use of them of international law, or even if that doesn't happen, but do you not foresee the prospect of the proliferation of drones, so that Americans walking down or shopping on Fifth Avenue, if it's the wrong type of person, might get zapped?
Well, I think that anybody walking down Fifth Avenue is going to find, much like walking down the streets of London. I think we're seeing the proliferation of technology on a wide-scale basis that we are completely unaware of. I think that if you stop and look at what's taking place with technology, it is basically proliferating by the minute. And virtually everything that you do and you say is now being recorded in one fashion or another, either through your iPhone or your BlackBerry. Blueberries are in Maine, blackberries are here in Canada. That everything that we do is now we're living in one of these societies in which everything is captured. And so the drones will be used, I think, for civilian purposes. I think you'll start seeing drones used for a variety of purposes. Traffic control, other types of monitoring. There is no stopping once the genie is out of the bottle in terms of trying to control the technology. The real issue should be that you mentioned, will you ever see drones being used to, in a military sense or for police purposes to target citizens and to take them out? I think they may be used to help capture. As a matter of fact, I suspect it probably was involved in trying to track down the individual, the former police officer in Los Angeles. I don't know if that's the case, but I suspect that will be a case in which they would try to put a drone up saying, where is he? See if we can track him down. That's for capture purposes. It's one step further to say, okay, if we know that that person is a terrorist suspect, or we think that that person is going to kill someone, can we take him out that way? That's when we start going down the slippery slope, when you have to make sure that Congress is involved in a major way to make sure this doesn't happen. But I think we're all at risk of being exposed in this society of ours.
Okay, I want to be conscious of the hour and just take two final questions for Secretary Cohen before we wrap up. But, ladies and gentlemen, they've got to be good, pungent questions that really push our speaker tonight. So who's going to volunteer? I see two here. The gentleman in the glasses. Let me go to him.
What should the West do about China's claim to the 8-dash line, which means the whole South China Sea, not just the islands but the waters, which to the Western viewpoint is international waters?
I think the United States continues to push back very hard on this issue because China is not only claiming the South China Sea but the East China Sea as well. What we are doing basically is pushing back by saying these are international waters. We intend to continue to be in international waters, and any disputes are going to be solved in a way that is through either the UN or peacefully, but not allow the domination of any one country. That's why this is so critical in terms of what's going on with Japan and China, and also with other countries, Philippines and others in the region. Let me tell you, the ASEAN countries really have invited the United States to play a major role. It's the ASEAN countries who now are the #1 trading partner with China. Their #1 trading partner is China. Used to be the United States. We're #4 now. So what they would like to do is the United States to continue to show more presence in the region and to send the signal that to China that we expect them to abide by international rules and not simply declare this is theirs and everything under it. And that's what what's at issue, what's under the water as well as what's on top of it. So the U.S. is going to take a pretty hard position on this, but you can only take a hard position if you can also back it up. So what we have to do is to continue to build our military, make sure that it doesn't get reduced in the way that I mentioned before with sequestration across the board, and to show that we are not a declining power. And there are some in China who believe that China is an ascending power, that America is a declining power. Peter and Melanie Monk had hosted a debate last year, some of you may have seen, with Henry Kissinger and Fareed Zakaria on one side, and I believe it was Neil Ferguson and also David Lee from China on the other. And on the way in, they took a poll. And the question was, will China dominate the 21st century? And I think the poll was about 55-45 at that point going in, that China would not. After the debate, it was more like 65-35 at that point, that they will not. They will play a major role, and they will continue to expand their military. But we have to not play a passive role in this, saying, no, we're there, we're going to continue to be there, we're going to reinforce all of these relationships to make sure that everybody abides by the same rule of law.
Great. William, you've been very generous with your time. I'm just going to look for a final question tonight. I'm going to go to this young woman right at the end of this table. Come up here and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, just a quick question going back to Israel for a second. I mean, understanding that Iran is a major threat, but so is some of the Arab Spring activity, and I know that in Israel there's a big concern about Jordan potentially falling to that, and because of the Palestinian unrest that's always characterized that country. So what are your thoughts on that, and what can the U.S. do in that context?
Well, what the U.S. is doing, that we, for example, we're strengthening relationships with the countries that are solid, UAE, United Arab Emirates. I'm leaving Friday to go there. There's a major defense exhibit as such where all of the countries in the world are going to be there. But UAE is very strong in terms of its relations with the U.S. They're also, by the way, it used to be when I was traveling throughout the Arab world, the first question always was Israel and blaming Israel for all of the problems. Now when I go there, they're really more worried about Iran. And so you have a strong relationship between the United States and the UAE. There's an arms package going to the UAE, which has been approved by the administration. And that arms package is designed to enhance the defense and offense capability of UAE. There's also a package that's up for the Saudis. And the Saudis are very concerned about Iran. Why? Because Iran is a revolutionary country. They exist by expanding. And so the Saudis are concerned about it, UAE is concerned about it, Qatar is concerned about it. So you have a number of moderate, certainly in Qatar and UAE, states that are concerned about what Iran is doing. And so they're building their defense capabilities, and we're working very closely with them to make sure that we can isolate Iran, and if it ever tries to take action, that you'll have a united front with the U.S., the Saudis, UAE, and others working on behalf of preserving our relationship with Israel. Israel itself, it's more nervous. It should be. Even if you go to Israel, you will find that business is booming. You would think that would be quite to the contrary, but business is still very strong, and they have an enormous capability, human capital. And as a result, they are continuing to prosper. They're working with virtually all other countries. They're working with India. They're working with China. They're doing business with everybody because everybody understands the kind of capabilities they have. Let me just conclude. Someone asked me earlier about Republican candidates coming up for the 2016. And Marco Rubio, you saw, a young man who I think has a long way to go in terms of he's young. He's on the cover of Time. It may be a bit premature to be saying he's the savior, but he's going to be one of the voices that you will hear, and a very strong candidate, given the demographics in our society today in America. There's Chris Christie from New Jersey, and some people say he's got a weight problem. And I would only point out that some years ago we had a President, William Howard Taft, who was of substantial girth. And he had a senator from New York named Chauncey Depew. And Chauncey Depew was having a lot of fun at the expense of the president. And he was at a dinner, much like this, and he was introducing the president. And he said, well, now I have the opportunity and the pleasure to introduce you a man who is pregnant with courage. Laughter started to go through the audience. He said, a man who is pregnant with intelligence, as Taft made his way to the podium. And finally, the president got to the podium, and he said, well, if I am pregnant with child, and that child born as a male child, I will name him Courage. If the child is a female, I will name her Intelligence. But if, as I suspect, it's simply a case of intestinal gas, I will name him Chauncey Depew. So I will end on that note. Thank you.